In this video, we're going to add openings for our connectors for our plastic housing. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to hopefully wrap up the design of our plastic housing. We're going to take a look at having openings for our connectors and just finalize some details. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I bring back my electronics housing and all the electronic components. Make sure they're all visible. We are still working in our electronics housing component though. Now what we want to do is we want to make an opening for our USB connector, an opening for the cables that are going into the front and the side, and we also want to potentially account for the reset. So when we think about these things, we need to first think about which direction are we're going to pull them from. Which direction are we going to have these openings? For the ones on the side, it's fairly straightforward because we designed it so that they go across the parting line. So once again, if we go to opacity control and we take this down, you can see that we have this connector. The wires are going into the bottom portion. So the upper portion, this is actually an opening for a spring release. So these are kind of neat connectors because you can take a stripped wire, in this case something like a 16 or an 18 gauge, and slide it in and actually will lock in place. Then you can stick a screwdriver or a very small pick or something in there to release it. So we only really need to have an opening on the bottom. Now, if we wanted to get really creative, what we could do is create a bunch of round sections that would let us insert the wires and then use epoxy or silicone to seal them up. So we're only going to focus on the bottom housing for this one here. And again, we're going to be using this as a reference. So I'm going to start a new sketch. I want to make sure that I use my XZ plane. So again, I'm going to hold down the left mouse button, go until I find XZ, and I'm going to start my new sketch. I want to make sure I know exactly where the top of this housing is. So I'm going to project the upper edges with P on the keyboard. And then I want to actually hide the housing because now I need to bring in some references that I can use for the center of these. Now, in order to make this happen, I'm going to use P on the keyboard and I'm going to select each of these internal faces where the wires go. This is going to bring those faces in. Then I don't have a center location, but I can use my line tool and simply go from these upper and lower sections. This is going to give me a midpoint that I can use. I'm just going to go ahead and do this on all of them, working my way over to the right. And while this isn't necessarily required, we know the spacing between these. It's standard electronic spacing. So what we could do is we could create one and pattern it. But sometimes I find that it's just easier if we can replicate that. So I want to take all those and convert them to construction. I don't actually need them. But what I need to do is I need to create a circle or some sort of geometry here that will actually allow me to create that opening. So I'm going to just go ahead and place these. I'm not dimensioning them yet because there's some other things that we need to discuss about this. Now, when you're using things like a circle, and we're using a circle in the context of molding, remember that we're pulling in the positive or negative Z direction. If the circle goes completely to the horizontal position, in this case 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, that means that we have no draft at that specific point. And when we have no draft, this is telling us that we can't pull it out of the mold. Now, there are instances or circumstances where we can actually make that okay, and we can get away with just some small drag marks. In this case, however, I'm going to hit escape to get off my circle tool. We want to figure out what that size actually is. We want to figure out the size of the wire that we want to run through there. And this looks pretty good, so I'm going to use D on the keyboard, and it looks like about 2 millimeters. Then I want to use equal, and I'm going to set each of these equal. Now, it's important to note when we're using the equal constraint, as I sort of work my way down to each next one, it's going to create an equal constraint from whichever first one we selected. If you want to add multiples, you can go ahead and pre-select them. And then I'll select the original, and we can say equal, and it'll add them all at one time. But it is important to note when we do that, you can see this one here is added to that. This one here, if we select the equal constraint, that one is added back to the beginning. And it's just kind of important, an important consideration. You can see it's added here, and then this one is going to be added here. So it's an important consideration that we should think about, because if I ever decide to, say, delete this one, then we want to understand the implications of all these constraints we added. So just kind of be mindful of that when you're designing. So now that we have all those positions, I'm going to hide the electronics. I'm going to bring back my bottom housing. Remember, we have to go up to this edge, that projected reference, but we want to be mindful of the fact that we can't just simply take this straight up. What we need to do is we need to create these cuts in a way that can actually be manufactured and have draft. So the way that I'm going to do this, because I have this vertical reference line, is I'm going to create some lines coming from this edge, and I'm going to come down and come from this edge and make sure that these are tangent. Then I'm going to use my dimensions, and I'm going to make sure that I have D for draft. It's going to be 2 degrees. I'm going to do the same thing over here. D for draft. I'm going to select draft and hit enter. And now what we should have is 2 degrees on either side. I'm going to hit escape. And now this entire profile here is going to be something we can extrude through the side, and we know that we have draft that we can use. But I don't want to do that every time. I don't want to sit here and just go through the process of just creating all of those. So let's figure out the distance between each of these. Let's just measure 2.5 millimeters exactly. So what I can do now is I can just create a pattern. I could have patterned the original, but I'm just going to pattern these two. I'm going to say these are my entities to pattern. We're going to go over to the right. We're going to go this direction. And we're going to figure out the extent or the spacing. Now in this case, we know the spacing. So I'm going to say minus 2.5 millimeters between each. Then I'm going to increase the number until I get all the way to that value 6. I'm going to say OK. And we want to double check that we actually have these entire closed profiles. If you weren't able to select the profile here, that means that this line was not actually coincident here. We would need to fix that. But now that we have our sketch, let's bring our bottom plastic housing back. Let's go to extrude all of these. And again, we could extrude one and then just pattern it with a feature pattern. But I'm just going to do this since we have it in the sketch. Grab all of these, just begin pulling it out, and we'll say through all. Objects to cut should only be this housing because it's the only one visible. And now what we've done is we've created this little sort of recess feature. We know that we have at least 2 degrees of draft. And when we bring back our circuit board, this allows us to run a cable or a wire through there. And we can use things like potting compound or some sort of RTV to help seal them. So it's a pretty neat way that we can go about that, and it works well when we have wires. But what about this USB connector? So this one's a little bit trickier because the top housing has a lot more plastic, a lot more things that we need to consider, and we're going to have a hole that needs to come through the side. And in order to make that work, what we end up having is we need to make sure that we can pull it from the top and the bottom. So we need to think about what's called a shutoff surface. So it's going to be a little bit tricky, but to get started, we need to think about the opening from the outside and the opening from the inside. So I'm going to go into my wireframe display. So we can use this again instead of using the opacity control just to take a look. And you can see where the USB connector is, and you can see that it comes just shy of this fillet here. So if we bring back our edges, we're going to use Control and 6 on the keyboard. We don't have to get rid of this fillet because the USB-C connector is really easy to use. We can just cut away a portion from this edge down to this face, and that should be fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my cut from this top view, and I'm going to use that as my reference. So when I do that, I'm going to start a new sketch. I'm going to select the top plane. I need to hold down the left mouse button. I need to find my XY plane. And you see that it rotated this around. I'm just going to flip it over because I want to work in it in this orientation. I want to select this edge and project it, again, P on the keyboard. And then I'm going to use my line tool, and I'm just going to create a line that comes out, over, and back. We're going to make this one vertical. And then we're going to hit escape, and we want to figure out where this line needs to be. Now, really what I want to do is I want to minimize the amount of impact or effect that I have on the rest of the housing. So I'm going to use D on the keyboard, and I want to figure out a distance that works here, and I'm going to say 4.5 millimeters is okay. Because this doesn't have to be square cornered, and ideally when we're cutting the mold, we probably don't want it to be, I'm going to add a fillet to the corner here, and I'm going to add it to this corner as well before I enter a value. And I'm going to increase this to 3 millimeters. We're going to say OK to finish that sketch. And then we're going to use this to start cutting through the housing. We're going to see how this is going to work. I'm going to hide the electronics. I'm going to hide the bottom housing. And I'm just going to work with this right here. We're going to extrude. And if I just pull this straight through the housing, you can see what we have. We've created this opening, but there's still some plastic that's back here. Now, this is where we really need to think about things like shutoff surfaces, because we're going to have to create a core or part of our mold on the inside that removes this wall, and it's not going to be available on the outside. So these are things that we need to think about. Another thing to consider is the fact that we don't have any draft on this right now. If we were to add draft, let's say 2 degrees, what we're doing is we're drafting outward, which might be okay. That means that the hole itself is going to be pulled from the outside. So everything that we see here is going to be pulled from the outside. But we need to be mindful of what that inside shape looks like. So when we look at the inside, that means we need a shutoff surface, something on the other side of the mold that can actually create that curvature. Let's go ahead and work with it in this orientation. We might have to come back and change it later, but let's at least try it. So we have that cut out, but we need to remove this entire wall because that's kind of in the way of our electronics. So if we bring the electronics back, we have this opening, but the USB-C is still sort of hidden in there. So in Fusion 360, in the solids tools, what we can actually do is we can select these faces we want to get rid of and hit delete, and we can allow it to try to patch it. Now, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. For us, you can see that it did not work. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to carry the shape all the way over until we're happy with where it's being removed. There are a couple different ways that we can do that. One thing that we can do is we can offset this face with tools like press pull. We can try to pull it back until it disappears. And in a lot of cases, this is a good option. It's only going to go to a certain point. You can see once I try to go past that fillet, it's starting to fail. But sometimes, depending on your geometry, that can be a good option and that can work. Another thing that we can do is we can modify our original extrude in the sketch that we used. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into the sketch, and instead of stopping here, right where our USB-C connector is, I'm going to come all the way to this edge. So I'm going to hit P on the keyboard to project that, and I'm going to draw another line, and I'm just going to draw this straight back. You'll notice that these are in line with each other based on the way we modeled this. So now I can finish that sketch. I'm going to edit my extrude, and I'm going to add this to my extrude feature. So you can see right now that's going all the way through. That's probably a bit too much to remove, but let's just try it and see. Remember, we are drafting outward. We might want to come back and add a fillet to these corners just to clean up the shape. Let's go to 2.5 millimeters, and then let's bring our electronics back and just see. I'm going to go ahead and activate the top level. And you can see here that we've got access to the USB-C, but we cut away quite a bit. Now, because we were working on symmetry and this is not actually symmetric, we can see that we've cut away quite a bit, probably well more than we need. So let's make some adjustments. We're going to go back to that sketch. So we're going to find that last sketch, and we're going to modify the sketch. So the sketch goes all the way to this edge, which is too much. This 4.5 is too much. So I'm going to take this down to 2.5, and I'm going to add another line at the midpoint. This is going to go right between that fillet. I'm going to finish this, and I want to modify that extrude feature. So this extrude, we're going to edit. I want to get rid of all the other bodies, and I want to reselect the profile. So I want to select just this, and you'll notice that this one is still selecting the whole thing, which is telling me that line did not go all the way. So I'm going to cancel that. I'm going to hide my electronics. I'm going to reactivate this. I want to go back into that last sketch. So again, it looks like it didn't go all the way. I want to make sure that when we're looking at this, that we can select the profiles that we're interested in. So that profile seems to be okay. That one seems to be okay. But you can see that there's this little piece here that we need to be careful with. So that seems to be okay. Let's roll back before the fillet, and let's edit this extrude feature. So again, we're going to just go ahead and cut that, rotate it around, and select the areas that we're interested in. So this one and this one here. You'll notice what happens is it's actually grabbing everything. It looks like this arc isn't meeting here, which is telling me that there's a problem with the sketch. So let's fix the sketch. Let's make sure that this is nice and clean. So what we did here is this radius value is larger than this distance here. So I want to reduce this. I'm going to go down to 2 millimeters, and that should clean everything up. Now, if we go back to this extrude, we want to remove that last little section. We don't want to go all the way to that fillet. We're going to say OK, bring that body back. And now it looks a little bit cleaner. Let's go to that fillet. Let's modify it because we changed the edges that we were using before. So we need to modify those. Let's add a little bit of a fillet there. And then let's just take a look. Bring the electronics back. Go back to the top level and let's see. So now you can see that we have a little bit more, or a little bit closer to the actual USB-C. So that's probably going to be okay. We can manufacture this. It does have draft, so we are able to manufacture it. And if we hide this and we look from the bottom, we still need to sort of fix this knife edge. That's not going to be a good solution. We want to get rid of that. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to get rid of these faces with surface tools, and we're going to manually patch them. So before we do that, let's save. And then we want to go into surface. And as I mentioned before, with surface tools, when we select something in surface and delete it, then it's going to turn this into a surface body. So we're going to select delete, and it gets rid of that. So now what we have is this edge here, which we can go to create, ruled. We're going to turn off chain selection. We're going to just take this edge. We want to extend it tangent. We're going to go like this. And remember, with ruled surface, what we're doing is we're creating a new surface. If we were to use something like extend, what ends up happening is extend will add it to this, and then it becomes really complicated. From here, we're going to say OK. Then next, we're going to do another ruled surface. We're going to select these two outside edges. Let's go ahead and reselect this. So this edge here, and we want to add this other edge. You'll notice that it's not allowing it because they're not connected. It really wants these edges to be connected. So I'm going to grab all of them. I'm going to change this to direction. And the direction that we want to go is actually going to be one of our reference planes. We're going to go down to this plane. And from there, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be extruding this edge out, and we're going to be drafting it. So let's just go 2 millimeters, see if we can bring this back. It's going to be in the minus direction. We want to go toward our housing. And then we're going to add a little bit of draft. It doesn't look like it's picked the direction, so let's go ahead and manually pick that again. And then we want to draft this outward. So I'm going to say D for draft. We're going to use the same draft values. And what we're looking to do here is we're creating a surface that we can use to trim away the rest of this. We want to carry this inside face as best as possible. We want to make sure that we can carry all that geometry out. So these are little things that you end up having to sort of work through if you're making a housing or you're making a design like this. We're going to say OK. And now we can use everything that we have to split faces, split bodies, or use it as a trim tool. Now, trim tools get a little tricky because all the other surfaces, except for these ruled ones we just created, are connected. So it's really a better idea to try to use something like split face. So the faces to split, in this case, we're going to split these two faces here and potentially these two over here. And the splitting tool, if this was all stitched together, this would work very well, but we're going to just do it one at a time. We're going to say OK. We're going to repeat that process. We're going to be splitting these two faces. Our tool is this. We're going to say OK. And we also need to keep part of this, but we're going to be splitting it with this. So we need to sort of do this as a dual thing. So we're going to split face. We are going to split these three. And the tool that we're going to be using is that original ruled. We're going to say OK. One more time, we're going to repeat. Now what we want to do is we want to split this, and we want to try to use this, this face, or we can select the entire body. We're going to say OK and see if it works. Let's take a look at the surfaces that we have. You can see if we didn't have this active at the time, what ends up happening is some of these bodies get put up here. So these are things that we need to be mindful of. Always be careful that you're working in the active component, or otherwise you can run into a situation like this where now I've got a few bodies at the top level. What we could do is we could fix that by sort of moving them around. I can take these bodies and drag them into here. Now, while this isn't the ideal situation, if you've worked and you've added a bunch of different features and sketches, and you got to the point where you really didn't want to go back and fix it, you can drag those bodies into this component just to make sure they're all in the right place. So now I can delete these with delete on the keyboard. I don't need that face. I don't need any of this stuff. This one, we have to be mindful of where it's split. It doesn't look like it's split. It's one single face. But the stuff on the inside, these can be removed. So I can select those and delete them. And we'll just have to do a little bit of work to trim that up. And then over here, we're going to have the same thing. We'll zoom in. We'll make some selections. Delete. And this right here is not split either. You can see that it's still left. But what we need to do is we need to sort of get to a situation where we've got this bottom face and we've got this side face, but only where we need it. So let's try again to use split face. The tool is going to be the housing, and the faces to split will be this. So the splitting tool, I'm going to try this and this. And you can see that it's giving me a preview on the screen, so I can say OK. But you'll notice that it didn't work. So let's try to use trim. Sometimes this will work OK. The trim tool is going to be the housing, and the piece that I want to remove, I'm going to rotate this around, is going to be everything outside of that face. So I say OK, and you can see it leaves me with that little sliver there. So I'm going to try the same thing on the other side. We're going to repeat trim. The trim tool is the entire housing, and the piece I want to remove is everything outside. And you can see it leaves me with that little bit. So the last thing we need to do is we need to sort of trim or split this up. So these are the last couple faces that we need to get rid of. And we could get rid of them and patch them, but it's going to be much cleaner if we just extend these faces out. So let's try this with the trim tool. Trim tool is going to be this, and the faces to remove are up here. You can see that it grabs the entire housing because it's all stitched together. We can try to get around this by unstitching these specific faces. If we undo this, we're going to get 253 faces. So we need to turn off chain selection, and we need to manually select the ones that we want to unstitch. So you'll notice that it's not letting us, we don't want to do it for the entire housing, but this way what we end up with is we can get rid of the rest of that housing and we can focus on just these pieces. So now it'll be a little bit better. We're going to try to stitch these three big pieces back together, and we're going to try to stitch these three pieces back together. And now we can try to use trim again. So this is our trim tool. This is what we want to remove. And then if we bring the rest of the housing back, everything should fill in all of the gaps. Now, again, the intention was not to make this a surfacing course or really talk about a lot of these surfacing techniques, but these are just things that you're going to have to do when you're working on complex injection molded parts. Most of the time, if it's a very simple design, you might be able to get away without doing this. But if you ever add any curvature or you work with any sort of organic shapes, then you're going to have to be extremely mindful of this. You can see that we kept our 2 degrees on those faces. Everything from this direction is drafted outward, which means that our shutoff surface is going to be this sort of opening here. So this is going to be something that you might need to go back and forth with a molding house to figure out if they can work with it. But for the most part, that's the process that we would need to run through. I'm going to bring my electronics back. You can see my USB-C is in there. We've opened up a little bit of space around it. We could make some additional adjustments. We could potentially bring the top face down a little bit, but I think that looks pretty good. One thing that we'll notice is that we have this little face right here, that filleted face that's kind of obscuring the USB-C. So this would need a little bit of work. We probably need to bring the cut that was in front of this, we would need to bring that down just a little bit. I don't know that it really adds much value to what we've done here. These are just minor details. And again, this component could be up higher or down lower, depending on what we end up using for standoffs. But I wanted to go through the general process of how we would go about this. I'm not going to replicate the openings for the wires on this side because that's pretty straightforward. And I'm not really going to create the small hole for the reset. Again, that's pretty straightforward. It's very easy to do relative to everything we've done to this point. But I do want to talk about, or at least review, what we've done because we've covered quite a bit. We've talked about a lot of surfacing tools, but I feel like we really need to focus on a few of the basics. So we understand that we have to have draft. Draft is important when we're talking about molded applications, but it's also important when we're talking about the orientation of features, the location of things like the groove, the tongue and groove or lip and groove. And when we're talking about our bosses, when we're talking about holding components like the circuit board. So these are all things that we need to consider. One thing that we didn't do or we didn't come back and do is positively locate the circuit board. Now, this is something that isn't necessarily required. When I say that it's not necessarily required, the reason I'm saying that is because we have techniques. So, what we designed here, sometimes you'll find these on production parts where they actually melt this boss and they melt it in order to sort of create a thermoplastic rivet to hold electronics in place. So they use, a heated gun. If you think of like a soldering iron, you could press that into a small recess in the center and you could melt this so that it holds the circuit board in place. That is one option. The other option would be for us to use some features off of the top of the housing to come down and touch the top of the circuit board. That's another option. Again, I don't really feel like it's going to add very much value to what we've done here, so I don't think it's worth the time at this point. If you need any additional information or you need some help going forward on some designs, you have some questions, then please let me know that. But again, I do want to just make sure that we reiterate that we took a lot of steps. We ran into a lot of problems along the way, things that I was anticipating in some fashion, but in other fashions I wasn't. Things like complexity for blending these corners and getting things to offset properly. I am glad that we did have to do some manual work to get this inside surface to work out so we could see that. But overall, I would like to know if you were able to follow along. If you did follow along or if you had any trouble along the way, I would like to hear some comments if it's in the video comments or if you send me an email. And if you learned anything, if you were able to progress your design skills, if you want to learn more, if there's anything specific, then I do have plans to continue on this series with more advanced designs. And when I say more advanced designs, I'm talking about things like living hinges, actually designing some snap latches, and maybe looking at some other more complex features. I think for right now, the topics that I didn't cover, we didn't really go into using forms because it got a little too deep into surfacing, but that's also something else we can do. We can talk about forms, but we've done that, quite a bit on this channel, so I didn't want to really go down that rabbit hole either. But again, if you have any questions, if you followed along and had trouble, or if you learned something or had any input, if you do this professionally or as a hobby, and you had any other tips or techniques or things that we may have missed or just sort of skipped over, then please let me know that as well. We're all here to learn. I can learn every time I use the software, and I think that's true for just about everybody. So just like always, thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one.